evening. My name is Janet Werner. This is a welcome to our Go Live Media That Matters, focused on the 988. So our objective tonight is twofold. One, it's just to open the conversation. Tomorrow we're at the first year anniversary of 988, and we're still working out the kinks. All the states are not signed on this. Our state in New Jersey is, and many other states. We want to explore the challenges and opportunities so each of us in our own states and across the country can start to make improvements before we get too far underway. We're going to also introduce the cultural and spiritual competency aspect for first responders, screeners, and mental health care providers, and even families and friends who use the 988 for a crisis situation. There are situations where it looks like a mental health situation, but it's actually a spiritual experience. And so that's one of our unique aspects. I'm going to bring Ernie Stevens on, and Ernie will introduce himself and also give us an introduction to what is 988. Very, very experienced professional. And Ernie, once you introduce yourself, give us a preview of 988, then please start to share what are your concerns and opportunities. Why do you even care about 988? So please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Janet, for having me. And to all the panelists that are going to join us later, I thank you for their time. And for those watching that took the time out of your evening after a long day of working or whatever you were doing, I appreciate you joining this conversation because it is something we need to do and understand what 988 is. When do we call 988, and what happens when we call 988? As Janet just talked about, we are at our 1 year anniversary. It was actually on July 16th of 2022 that 988 was launched, and that's when people in crisis can reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline just by dialing or texting 988. Previously, that crisis line was a 10-digit number, and it is very difficult for people to remember that number. But 988 services are distinct and they're separate from the emergency medical and public safety responses associated with 911. So what is 988 and when do I call it? Well, it's a new resource for people in crisis. It's a transformative movement in America that normalizes people calling for mental health services when in a crisis. And furthermore, what it does is it limits law enforcement's involvement into the crisis, which I think is what really community members have been asking for such a long time. 988 is more than just an easy to remember number. It's a direct connection to compassionate, accessible care and support for anyone experiencing a mental health distress, including thoughts of suicide, mental health or substance use crisis, non-crisis emotional distress, or concern for a loved one who may need crisis support. So as you can see, there's a lot of facets to 988. You can call, you can text, you can chat the number. What we've seen already in just this 1 year is the number of calls have doubled. So last year, the numbers were a little over 2 million people called the crisis line and the suicide help hotline. This year, because 988 is such an easy number to remember, we've had over 4 million people call. And I think what's most interesting about the calls is the data that has been tracked. And that is 98% of the calls that come into 988 are resolved over the phone. It's usually a resource or somebody maybe just needs to talk with somebody, maybe de-escalate or just vent. I mean, I vent every time the Dallas Cowboys play and I need somebody to talk to. So it's not unusual, for somebody to need somebody to talk to. That's nothing to joke about. That's a serious matter. And 988 provides that opportunity. But with 988 comes some challenges, right? Number one, do you even know what 988 is or when to call? What does law enforcement know about 988 and when do they give out that resource to community members? What happens if you don't know about 988 and you call 911? Will that call ever be transferred by law enforcement to 988? Because these are to protect your privacy. It's anonymous. That's very important that 988 was established with the idea of to provide that anonymity to the caller. The challenges, though, that come with 988 is there is no geofencing for these calls. And what I mean by that is I live in Texas. I was just in Colorado yesterday. So if I was in Colorado and I called 988, because of my area code, the number would have rung in Texas, and I would have had a mental health professional answer the call 988 in Texas. If I would have needed resources in Colorado, it would have taken some time to route that call back into a tower that's closest to my location. So there are some challenges. There's challenges of liability when it comes to transferring a call from law enforcement to 988. There's liability when you don't geofence a call, because what happens if somebody calls in that is acutely suicidal and there's no way to send help to that person because you just don't know where they are. So it's a good discussion that we're going to have. We're going to talk about the pros and the cons of 988. We're going to talk about ways that we can improve it, because if you look at the 911 system, it took at least 10 years for that system even to get online and start working properly. So I ask that you be patient with the 988 process as states learn how to make this sustainable by using federal dollars to fund this, along with taxpayers, or not taxpayer dollars, but your cell phone bill. You may see a charge there for 988 if you haven't already, because they're looking at ways to make this sustainable for people all across the United States. So thank you for having me again, Janet. And I did forget one thing. Who is this guy? So this guy, Ernie Stevens.
Who's Ernie?
Yeah. Yeah. So I spent 28 years in law enforcement with the San Antonio Police Department. I was a mental health officer. So I responded on the mental health unit to people that would call in for a mental health crisis. And then my job was to go out there and try to find the best resources possible for the individual, whether that was try to find them an intake appointment, offer resources, take them to go see a provider. Whatever the issue was, we were trying to do our best to, number one, divert away from jails and prisons, and number two, create some type of treatment plan for that individual to where they could be successful on the back end of the call and have resources and wraparound services where they wouldn't need to call the police. I'm now currently the Deputy Division Director for the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and I lead the portfolio for the Law Enforcement Division. And 988 is a big topic on the national level that we're talking about, and trying to find ways to build a roadmap and make it just a better way to work together collaboratively with law enforcement partners.
Thank you so much for that intro. Ernie, from the year I've known you, the term that also comes to mind is de-escalation. You put that into my mind and heart, that's what you do sincerely, you and Joe. The movie that you have, Crisis Cops, shows that so clearly. And that just to me almost is the precursor to what we're doing. Like you are doing de-escalation. You have influenced so many people. And that's what we also need in the whole 988 process to de-escalate. So thank you. Thank you so much to be here. A year ago, I asked Ernie if he ever heard of people having a spiritual religious experience when you went out to mental health calls and you were de-escalating. And if you would comment on that, and then what you have, it seems that you have really studied a lot from that moment when I said there's really a real thing here, of which you said that you do have the experience.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you, Doctor, for your comments. They really do hit home. I spent 28 years in law enforcement, but my last 12 years were dedicated strictly to a mental health unit. So I was dispatched out to calls of every variety you could think of. People that were feeling suicidal, people that were struggling with PTSD, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, you name it. Many occasions, when we arrived on scene, there was this, in a term used in law enforcement, it's not to offend anybody, was a hyper-religiosity. A person was experiencing hyper-religiosity where either they believed that their creator was speaking to them and giving them command, I guess just commands to do certain things or act a certain way. And it was very difficult, being an officer, that you get some training, you get a little bit of training, crisis intervention training, to learn how to de-escalate and recognize a mental health crisis, and then learn about what resources are available to you. But when you come face to face with an individual that's not truly a danger to themselves, but what they are saying or displaying seems so abnormal to what the general public is doing or acting, it causes confusion for law enforcement. And for if you're a first responder, you're supposed to know the answers to everything. So when you're ignorant about what a spiritual crisis or emergency looks like, it's very difficult for you to try to connect and show empathy with an individual that's going through that, right? On the surface and optics, you think, this person's delusional, and I have no other choice probably but to hospitalize them, right? Now, there are some occasions, right? And I'll give you an example of a real case scenario. And it was an individual that was fasting that said that they were not, that their creator gave them the answer of how to solve world hunger, and they were not going to ever eat again unless the president was aware of this plan and would implement, this plan to solve world hunger. This person had not eaten for almost 3 weeks, was looking severely dehydrated. Had medics come out to the scene, and there was some during the triage of the patient. There was some concerns with their medical condition as well. So there are sometimes scenarios that you face in law enforcement or as a first responder where it's one of those, I don't know what to do. All I know is I want to err on the side of caution. And I only know what to do based on the training I've received. And the training I received really did not cover a whole lot of what a spiritual crisis may look like or how does it present. Because in crisis intervention training, you get psychologists that will come in and speak, psychiatrists that will come in and speak, people that run different types of resources, your local mental health authority, they'll come in and speak. But what you don't get is the spiritual aspect from a credible person, from I guess, a professional in that field, whether it's a chaplain, a pastor, a priest, to come in and really give you a broad overview of, hey, this is how it might present, and this is probably how you might want to try to approach it for best possible outcome. So I'm glad, it's interesting that the conversation developed into this, and then you got to think, how do we tie this back to 988?
Yes.
Well, take law enforcement out of it, and now it's a call taker. And what if a call taker doesn't understand, right? So what are we doing as far as training and implementing policies and procedures to handle a caller that maybe is experiencing one of these situations?
So what really needs to go into the training? Ernie, I know you've done so much training. Your crisis cops did, a lot to improve de-escalation and empathy and compassion of first responders. Now we're at this next level with 988. I would love to hear from each of you and also our viewers, what needs to go into the training? What is the training like? Do we even know? And what needs to go into the training of the whole 988, all the staff, all the people?
So that's a good question, right? Because there's not a national curriculum for call takers when it comes to 988. 988 is left up to the state to run and figure out how they're going to make it, where they're going to put call centers, how they're going to staff it, how they're going to pay for it. So it's really up to the states to figure this out. So as I think as we move forward and continue to try to make this a more robust system, you're going to have to look at some centralized training throughout the states. One thing I think is important, and one thing that we introduced with crisis intervention training, and I've heard this word come up several times today, is trauma. A lot of officers, law enforcement officers, couldn't tell you the true meaning or definition of what trauma is. So they really don't understand it. If I were to ask, if I were to go to a roll call today and just say, hey, one of your officers, could you tell me what trauma is? I guarantee you I'm going to probably hear something along the lines of, well, trauma is when something bad happens to you. And that's just truly not the case. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. That's the true definition of trauma. So I think if you understand that, then you will understand why you react to the way you do to certain situations, why officers react to the way they do about certain situations, why they like handling some calls and they don't, and they try to avoid others. It's no different. This is human behavior than a call taker at 988. They may be dealing with some type of unprocessed trauma that happened to them very early on at an early age. And that's why I think adverse childhood experiences is such an important course to teach, not only to first responders, but to these call takers, because once they truly understand what trauma is, they can add value and benefit to the conversation to the caller that needs assistance, right? But it's an educational process. So I think really at the basic level, you have to start there, because people are calling because either they were triggered, something has not been resolved, and they've just lost the ability to cope. And that's where these call takers are so vitally important, to try to provide that type of resource.
Yes, and bringing up the trauma, the trauma-informed support has been coming out for, I guess, quite a few years now, but it's such an important piece to look at, because again, there is a service and a de-escalation versus let's immediately ship the person to hospitalization and medication.
And I love, Ernie, your comments about the ACEs and trauma. Often, in fact, probably most often in a crisis situation, I do have to also listen for trauma. And was whatever this reaction is just an event in today where something has been triggered? And if I can even begin to make that connection that the person can't, it really makes a big difference for them just to de-escalate themselves.
So I'm going to also then ask to see, what are we looking down the road? Again, we're the first year into this, and there is an urgency to speed up the education, the service, the awareness. Let's hear some alternatives, ideas from both our audience, but from anyone here. And then also marry it with concerns, because there are some of the questions about that were raised earlier around without the training, without the awareness, people are picked up, found when they're just calling for help. And there's this numbers, I don't know if we have them here, but numbers of people are moved into hospitals like very quickly. Family, society, responders do not know. So what are your ideals, and what are any concerns of what you see happening right now? Would love the team to start sharing. Even if you said it before, it might be worth mentioning again.
Well, Janet, I think, you got to look at the bandwidth of what 988 can handle.
Yeah.
So I was in DC back in January, and we hosted a forecaster along with SAMHSA, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the DOJ, and we were talking about, what does a roadmap look like with 988 in conjunction with working and collaborating with law enforcement. And I was moderating one of the panels, and I asked everybody in attendance, who in here is actually called 988? And nobody raised their hand. It's like, but we've been chosen to come together to talk about how we improve this process, but yet nobody knows how it works. Well, I called 988. I wanted to know how it worked. And it was interesting, right? They give you an option if you're a veteran. You have an option if you want the message in Spanish, but you're also going to get a recording at the very beginning. And what I learned by going to a 988 center and watching some of these, and not listening, but watching the calls come in and how they're handled, is if these calls aren't answered in about a 2-minute proximity, then they bounce to the very next tower. And I think Illinois, 80% of their calls to 988 don't even get answered in Illinois. They get bounced because there's such a long wait of callers and a high volume of callers in Illinois, and they just don't have the bandwidth to be able to answer these calls. So you have to look at, how do we staff this at such a large scale, and how do we scale it, and then at what point, because we want law enforcement, right? As the calls come into 911, they need to be triaged properly, right? Is this an appropriate call for 911, or can we transfer this call more appropriately to 988 if it is a mental health crisis? But what does that look like? Where's the liability? Every time we try to take a step forward with law enforcement, Everything has to stop, and city attorneys have to look at it. County attorneys have to look at it. There has to be a consensus that this is a safe way to do things. Now, in Englewood, Colorado, their police department there has begun to transfer calls to 988 on a very small scale. What they're trying to do is scale up to be able to get Denver, which is their largest city there, to be able to transfer these calls. The problem is the bandwidth. They just don't have the amount of call takers to be able to handle the sheer volume of the calls coming in. So I think you really have to look logistically of how do we build a framework of a good working basis of a workforce to where we can even handle these calls. And then once we know we can handle the sheer volume of it, now we have to figure out how do we get law enforcement to now come closer to the table, because they're not even in the same room right now because of the liability issues, to get them to understand that, hey, the majority of these calls that go to 988, 98% of them are handled over the phone. It's so difficult to recruit in law enforcement. Call any law enforcement agency and ask them how many officers they're down. They're going to say, for your larger agencies, 500. Austin PD, 3, 4, 500. San Antonio, 3, 4, 500. New York, thousands. So why not collaborate with 988 as a way to say, hey, we're going to help take some of this load off of you by allowing mental health calls to go to mental health professionals. The problem with law enforcement is, and I'll say this because I was there for so long, we complain. We don't want to take all these mental health calls. We're not social workers, but the minute you try to take them away and say, hey, well, we're going to start transferring these calls or send them to a community responder team where it's a medic and a clinician to respond, we're going to take law enforcement right out of it. Well, what are you doing? You're going to get civilians killed. You can't do that, right? So there's this push-pull, and it's a constant battle of what's the best way to handle these calls. Right now, if they come in at 911, the liability is it's going to stay with 911 until you can get some progressive leadership to say, hey, there's a better resource for this particular call based on the triage, and we can send this to 988.
Well, Ernie, you've had such lengthy experience in the de-escalation of mental health calls. Is there something we can borrow, learn from the amount of training you did over the years? And that, I don't know, can we transfer that also into the whole 988 training?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, thank you for you giving me way too much credit. But, I think, and I love what Dr. Shotlis just said. He used the word well-being. I think law enforcement has to redefine what safety is, right? Safety is no longer can be seen as the absence of crime. It has to be seen as the presence of well-being. And that means the total well-being of a community. The part of the lessons I learned about responding to an individual in crisis is you have to look at the person and not the problem, right? The problem is usually emotionally charged in some way, form, or fashion. But if you can look at the person and truly connect with them, then you will get a connection over correction. That means let's not look at correcting the issue, the problem, whatever you want to label it. Let's make a connection with this person. And we can do so by looking at the person and not the problem. And I think by doing that, that's how you create empathy. And there's power in that. There's power in human connection. And in the documentary, I use the example of a lamp. When you unplug a lamp, it doesn't work. Same thing with a person. When a person becomes unplugged, they don't work as well, right? They begin to digress, and it becomes dangerous to be in that, and to be, in that environment, when you've lost all hope or you're feeling worthless. And so I think by really focusing on the person in that moment, through empathy and human connection, it doesn't matter if you're a call taker, a first responder, or a family member. You truly have to learn how to listen to a person. And listening doesn't mean trying to problem solve by giving them the answer to what you think solves their problem. Because I promise you, you're not in their shoes and it's not your problem. The best thing you can do is just simply listen and validate and be there as a resource for that person and show your support and love. So I think whether you're showing up in person or you're a call taker, these are lessons that should be foundational.
Yes. And, imagine that the amount of human suffering that can be saved by doing that. And I'm going to put some not numbers, but financial pieces, how much money can be saved by listening and talking. And even Ernie, I keep picturing you de-escalating the family who has called in 988 on the person, and that you could actually sit down and talk with the family to de-escalate. This is not a hospital situation. And the human suffering that gets saved, and the financial burden that gets saved by not just reacting. So who would like to do your closing comment, your message to the world of 988? Let's figure this out fast.
Janet, I'll throw in some comments, and really they're just resources. Exactly what Christina said. The more we know about it, the more we know how to be informative to other people. I think is going to help really get the message out about what 988 is, when to call it. Again, like I said, I work at the Council of State Governments Justice Center right now. We have online resources that are free. We have a 988 pocket card for law enforcement, kind of like what Christina held up, but it's for law enforcement officers to go to them so they can read it, understand it, and then hand it out to the public. And then we also have some videos online with interviews with chiefs of police, sheriffs, dispatchers, and call takers. It's called 988, A Shared Opportunity. You can Google those and watch those videos and kind of get a better understanding. Be sure to share them. One of the most important things you can do is have a conversation with your local law enforcement agency of what 988 is. Try to get that into some CIT training curriculum within your local law enforcement agency, and really at the jails. And because when you talk about re-entry programs for people getting out of jail, they may not know what resources are available to them, especially if they've been locked up for the past year and not heard of 988. So this is a good opportunity to educate and give resources to people that are re-entering into the community from the jail population.
And please join us on our Facebook Media That Matters with questions. This will be posted. We will cause more of a conversation as we go forward. Just to keep in mind, part of what our global team is doing to support the entire initiative is to bring a documentary out into public around all of these issues we raise, not just 988, and to also do a feature-length movie. We are looking for collaborators in all parts of the organizations, investors, and supporters to help build these global initiatives. Oh, there we go. That is a link to the IMDb for our documentary. So I want to thank you. We will be scheduling a follow-up in August. Again, 988. We will have some of you back if you wish, and we will be adding other leaders from New Jersey and around the nation. So thank you.